Good morning, good afternoon, or good night, and welcome to Command Power, the show in which we discuss all things Magic the Gathering with a focus on Commander. And today we have a brand new deck tech for you from the new set Phyrexia All Will Be One. And just a quick heads up, this is not a budget deck tech, so there are going to be some expensive cards in there, although I think it shouldn't be too hard to find substitutions for those expensive cards. But before we do that, just a quick reminder to please click subscribe if you enjoy these videos. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm really notices me, and we're currently growing the channel, and it helps me a lot. Much appreciated. And the commander we are going to be talking about today is Venser Corpse Puppet for 1 blue and 1 black. It's a legendary creature, Phyrexian zombie wizard 1/3 with lifelink, toxic 1, and whenever you proliferate, choose 1. If you don't control a creature named the Hollow Sentinel, create the Hollow Sentinel, a legendary 3/3 colorless Phyrexian golem artifact creature token, or target artifact creature you control gains flying and lifelink until end of turn. Now, Venser was one of the first planeswalkers to be killed by the Phyrexians as far as I know, and his card does not disappoint here. It's actually a really strong card that has a lot of different ways to build around. So the main thing you're going to be building around obviously is proliferate, because it's right there on the card. That's what's going to be triggering Venser, and the trigger that we're getting is pretty strong. We're going to be getting a repeatable artifact that we can use for a lot of different purposes. So I have a few cards in the deck that can sacrifice artifacts, because once we sacrifice it, every time we proliferate, we're just getting it right back again. Obviously, there's also a few artifact creatures in the deck to benefit from getting lifelink and flying. There's a few creatures that benefit from the evasion given by the flying, but mostly we're going to be building the deck around poison counters and proliferate, which is a very efficient way to win the game, although it might not make you that many friends. So without further ado, let's get started with the deck list, and we're starting with Archfiend of the Dross, which is a really undercosted flyer that's going to be very good in this deck. We're proliferating so much that it's incredibly unlikely that we can't keep oil counters on this. We're going to have a massively undercosted card that is also going to drain our opponents every time one of their creatures dies. That seems very good to me. Next up, we have Blightbelly Rat, which is a creature that maybe doesn't look that impressive on the surface, except that it also has toxic 1. That means their opponents are going to have to choose to let us proliferate or take a hit from this. This is basically almost always going to just proliferate, since nobody wants to get a poison counter on them for free against a deck that's built around proliferate. Chittering Skittling not only has a great name, but is also really strong in this deck. We're often going to have opponents with 3 or more poison counters on them, and then we can sacrifice an artifact or creature to draw a card. Since the token created by Venser is an artifact creature, we can sacrifice it once during our turn, proliferate, then get it back, then sacrifice it again during our opponent's turn, proliferate, get it back, and it's just a really strong loop that's also going to put our opponents pretty close to dying since they're already infected at that point. Crystalline Crawler is a great card in any deck that plans on proliferating. It's going to come in with 2 counters, but it'll get more counters very easily with all the proliferate we've got going, at which point you can remove counters on it to add mana, or you can give it lifelink and attack for a massive life swing, which is great. Frost Scorpion is a really nice synergy card in this deck. We have quite a few artifacts in the deck that tap to do stuff. For example, Staff of Completion and Throne of Geth, which we will talk about later, and this just combos so well with them, particularly with Throne of Geth, since we're going to be sacrificing our commander's token. It's going to proliferate, then the Throne of Geth is going to untap, we're going to get the card back, and that gives us infinite proliferates. Obviously, we're not actively trying to do that because infinite combos are not the best, but it is cool that it can show up now and then, and it works really well with some of the other cards in the deck too. Flux Channel is just really good because it's going to let us proliferate a lot in this deck. Gilpack Informant is just another cheap way to get proliferate triggers. Ichor Rats is really good for giving everybody a poison counter when it comes in, including yourself, so do be careful if there's another proliferate deck on the table, because you might find yourself in trouble. Phyrexian Metamorph is really good because it's going to copy a really big creature ideally, or something really strong on the table, and because it still retains its artifact status, we can still give it flying and lifelink with Venser's ability, leading to a lot of life gain for us, hopefully. Scheming Aspirant is going to drain our opponents for so much in this deck and keep us alive. It's very innocuous as a 1/3. This is going to gain us so much life and buy us so much time that it's going to be great in this deck. Serum Sovereign is going to come in and get some oil counters whenever we play a non-creature spell, which is most of our deck, and then with all the proliferate we're going on, we can keep her very nicely stocked, and just paying 1 blue mana is going to give us a free Serum Visions, which is fantastic. Do note that there's no restriction of once per turn or sorcery speed, so as long as you have 1 blue mana up and 1 oil counter on it, you can do this at any time. That's going to be very easy to achieve in this deck. Every single non-creature proliferate spell we have is going to give her 2 counters. Silas Wren Seeker Adept is a great way to get some recursion late game. It's already a creature that people don't usually want to block because of the death touch, and crucially it's an artifact creature, which means the Venser can give it flying and lifelink, at which point we can play an artifact card from our graveyard if this connects. That's really good. Tegutal Inquiry Dominus is going to be one of the best cards in the deck, no doubt. Our whole theme is proliferate, so this is going to double up on all of that, and it's pretty easy to make it indestructible as well. Thrumming Bird is another cheap way to proliferate. Unctus Grand Meta Tech we made a deck about a couple of days ago, and it's also going to be very good here because we have quite a few blue creatures and artifact creatures that are all going to loot, and then for 1 Phyrexia we can make any of our creatures an artifact for the turn, which then allows it to be targeted by Venser's ability, gaining us presumably all the life back that we just spent. With Alkin Humiliator, it has a couple of nice little combos with it. Seeing as we're almost always going to have Metalcraft active, this is going to turn all of our opponent's creatures into 1/1s until end of turn. We can then drop something like Contagion Engine and just wipe one of our opponent's boards, or we can drop something like Toxic Deluge for 1 and destroy all of their creatures while keeping ours alive. Viral Drake is going to allow us to proliferate on demand for 4 mana. It also has Infect, so it can get the ball rolling. Voidwing Hybrid I really like for being a recursive evasive threat with Toxic 1. So they have to continually have flying blockers, or this is going to eventually get through because we can keep returning it every time we proliferate. It's going to be very, very hard to deal with in this deck and really annoying for a 2-drop. Yawgmoth Ram Physician is one of the really expensive cards in the deck that you can consider cutting if you have something else. It's not a particularly fun card in this deck. It has so many little combos and synergies that make it go off in a big way. So if you want the deck to be a little bit more interactive and fun, or you don't have the budget for this could be one of the cards you cut. Next up, we have artifacts, and we're starting off with Astral Cornucopia, which is a mana rock that is going to work really well with Proliferate because it comes in with charge counters on it. This can get really silly late game for an initial investment of only 3. Contagion Clasp is going to allow us to put a -1/-1 on 1 creature, which we can then proliferate. So we're probably going to get to kill something, but we're playing it mostly because it gives us another way to proliferate on demand. Contagion Engine is like the big daddy of Contagion Clasp. It's going to put counters on all of one of our opponent's creatures, and then it's going to proliferate twice. This is incredibly stupid with Teguthal. Empowered Auto Generator is a really cool mana rock. It's going to come in tapped, which is a little bit awkward, and for 4 mana, that is definitely not the best. But then we can start the ball rolling. The first time we use it, it's only going to give us 1 mana, but after that, when we start proliferating, this is going to give us tons and tons of mana, and basically turns into another copy of Astral Cornucopia. Everflowing Chalice is another great one, similar to Astral Cornucopia and Empowered Auto Generator. It's going to come down early, and then every time we proliferate, it just gets better and better and scales infinitely. Glistening Sphere is great in this deck. This is the perfect shell for this card. We want everything that this card's doing. It's going to proliferate, which is fantastic, and then it's going to very easily add 3 mana of any color for us because we're almost certainly going to have Corrupted. That just makes it one of the best mana rocks in the game in this deck. Pentat Prism is basically the same as Everflowing Chalice, although it is a little bit more awkward if we don't have a lot of proliferate already available. Replicating Ring is going to work really well in this deck, which is good because we're quite a mana hungry deck. So at the beginning, we're just going to get 1 counter on Replicating Ring at the beginning of our upkeep, but if we have 8 counters on it, we remove all of them and we create 8 mana rocks, and then the whole thing starts again the next turn. We get a counter on it, and then we can proliferate and proliferate and proliferate. So with this out, we can just make an absolute army of artifact mana rocks, which is hilarious. Sol Ring is just one of the best mana rocks in Commander. Staff of Completion is again a perfect fit for this deck. Even the first mode can be relevant sometimes if we want a way to sacrifice one of our artifacts, but apart from that, all the other modes are great because we have a mana rock, which is fantastic. We have Proliferate, which is obviously something we're very interested in, and we have Draw a Card. Those are all really good. And once you factor in that we're gaining life with the lifelink from our commander, then this becomes a lot less painful than it would normally be. We're also generating so much mana with our proliferating mana rocks that we should be able to untap it a few times per turn and really go off. Strixhaven Stadium is a card that normally I would say is pretty unfun and pretty easy to win with, but we're already playing Poison, which is definitely worse than this, so it's just another way to get the ball rolling and another way to get an alternate win con. Sword of Truth and Justice is going to protect one of our creatures and make it much easier to connect, at which point we get to proliferate. You can also do some interesting nasty stuff with it by putting a +1/+1 counter on something like Viral Drake, at which point it has Infect, so it's going to be dealing damage equal to its power, but in poison counters. Tablet of Completion is another mana rock. It's one of the slow ones, but it's not going to be that bad in a deck with this much proliferate. So basically, as long as it has 2 oil counters on it, we're going to be able to add a mana, at which point it's a 2 mana rock, which is fine. And then late game, when it's got enough counters on it, it can also just draw us a card every turn for 1 mana, at which point it becomes excellent. Throne of Geth has so many interesting combos in this deck and works so well with the artifact token created by Venser that it's basically an auto-include. Vat of Rebirth is going to work really nicely because every time any artifact or creature we control is put into the graveyard, we're going to get an oil counter on it, but we don't actually need them to die. We only need to get the first one, after which we're just proliferating. And then once per turn, we can remove 4 oil counters from it and just return a creature card from the graveyard straight to the battlefield, which is absolutely insane. Next up, we're moving on to our enchantments. We have Inexorable Tide, which is one of the best proliferate cards in the game. Whenever we cast any spell, we just proliferate. Inventive Iteration Proliferation is one of a few sagas we have in here. Sagas are actually really cool with Proliferate because you get to go off the turn you play them if you have enough Proliferate going on. So this one fits really well because we can instantly bounce something for our opponents, which is the weakest mode, but then we immediately go to the second mode if we have any Proliferate out, at which point we can return one of our artifacts from the graveyard to our hand, which is nice recursion, and if we can't, we still get to draw a card, which is fine. Then this is going to flip onto the other side, which is a really interesting card. Every time we play a spell, our opponents can't play anything with the same mana value until our next turn. That can really screw with some opponents. Phyrexian Scriptures is going to be a fantastic board wipe in this deck. We're running a bunch of artifact creatures, so it already affects us less than it would normally, but then we get to put a +1/+1 counter on one of our creatures and protect it, and if we have Proliferate out, we can immediately destroy all non-artifact creatures, at which point this is damnation with upside for us. That's insane. The Eldest Reborn is a nice way to get a lot of value. It's basically a 7 for 1, but the downside is that you usually have to wait 3 turns for it to happen. In our deck, we might even be able to get all 3 modes off in 1 turn. 5 mana for making our opponents sacrifice 3 creatures, discard 3 cards, and return a planeswalker or creature to the battlefield under our control is really, really good. And finally, the last saga in the deck is the War in Heaven. This is in here mostly because of the 3rd mode, but the other 2 modes are decent too. Even if we ever only get the 1st mode off, it's still not the worst. We draw 3 cards and lose 3 life. And as soon as we proliferate, we mill 3 cards. Hopefully we mill some decent creatures. And with the last one, we're going to be able to return a bunch of creatures with mana value 8 or less total from the graveyard to the battlefield. And then they're going to become artifacts. So that works really well with Venser's ability to grant them lifelink and flying. There's also a couple of other synergies in the deck, like with Phyrexian Scriptures. So it's just very nice. Next up, we're moving on to instants. We have an Offer You Can't Refuse, which is a bit of interaction that you'll see in a lot of my decks. It's just a very good counterspell. Anoint with Affliction is going to be decent removal early and then really good removal late. Bring the Ending is similarly a situational counterspell early, but then late game is just an easier to cast counterspell. Experimental Augury is an absolutely fantastic card that should be in most blues decks these days, as long as they're even slightly interested in counters. Fuel for the Cause is a counterspell that's going to proliferate. Grim Affliction can be pretty good removal in this deck, as long as we're not against players running +1/+1 counters. Prologue to Phyresis is going to be great because it's one of the ways to get the ball rolling with the poison counters, and it's going to draw us a card to boot. Reject Imperfection is a hard counterspell, but if we counter something small, we also get to proliferate. Serum Snare is basically the same thing. We can return any non-land permanent to our opponent's hand. However, if it's something cheap that we're returning, we also get to proliferate. Steady Progress is just unconditional proliferate at instant speed for 3 mana that draws us a card. That's great. Stoic Rebuttal is almost always going to be on in this deck, and it's just going to be a 2 mana counterspell. Vraska's Fall is going to remove 3 creatures from our opponents, giving us a 3/1 and give them all a poison counter, all for 3 mana at instant speed. That's a steal. And Whisper of the Dross is one of the weaker cards in the deck, but it's still going to proliferate for 1 mana at instant speed, and that's basically why we're running it. We also occasionally get to snipe some little 1/1 elf or something, which is decent. Now we're moving on to sorceries. We have Contentious Plan, which is another cheap way to proliferate. Distorted Curiosity is going to be a decent draw spell early, and then a fantastic one late game. Drown Inika is decent removal that also is going to proliferate. Geth Summons can either be an acceptable reanimation spell or an exceptional one late game. Infectious Inquiry is another way to get the poison ball rolling, and it's also attached to a pretty reasonable card. Drawing 2 and losing 2 for 3 mana isn't the worst. Phyresis Outbreak is yet another way to get the poison ball rolling, and it's going to be pretty reasonable removal mid to late game. If our opponent already has 4 or 5 poison counters, which isn't unthinkable, this is going to wipe most of the board, and it's one-sided, so that's really solid. Spread the Sickness kills a creature and proliferates. 5 mana is pretty expensive, but we do want as much proliferate as we can get. Tezzeret's Gambit is a very reasonable proliferate spell. It's really similar to Infectious Inquiry, except instead of giving a poison counter, we proliferate. Toxic Deluge is one of the best board wipes in Commander. It's particularly good in this deck because we're gaining life with our Commander, so we should be pretty able to spend that life. Finally, Vat Emergence is another way to proliferate, and it's nice that it allows us to take a creature card from any graveyard and not just our own. And now we're moving on to our utility lands. We have Academy Ruins, which is always good in any deck running artifacts. Being able to recur them and put them back on top of your library is really good. But Jukabog is going to deal with our opponent's graveyards. Inventor's Fair is great in any deck with artifacts. It's going to gain us some life, which is good because we have a lot of cards that are costing us life in this deck. And late game, we can just search up for a really strong artifact and put it straight into our hand. Khan's Bastion is another great way to proliferate. Mirrex can provide a mana of any color the turn it comes in, but more importantly, it can make little 1/1s with Toxic that can be pretty annoying. Reliquary Tower is going to give us no maximum hand size. This might come up quite a bit in this deck because we are drawing a lot of cards. Dreadship Reef is surprisingly good in this deck. It comes in untapped, which is fine. The only cost is that it's colorless, but then we can put storage counters on it, which we can proliferate, and then later on in the game, we can remove any number of them to have a pretty big turn. The Monumental Facade is going to be a really good way to get oil counters onto some of our cards that need them to get going. Also, the opportunity cost of playing it is next to none, seeing as we're a 2-color deck and it comes in untapped. The Mycosynth Gardens is great in any deck running a high amount of artifacts, and we can just copy all sorts of different things to really go off in this deck. What do you think? Are there any things you would change? Any additions that you think I missed? Please let me know in the comments section below. I read all comments and respond to all of them too. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click like or subscribe. It really helps the channel. And until next time, take care. Woo!